Neither of those deals were recommended to be blocked by the Foreign Investment Review Board on national security provisions. Has Australia left itself vulnerable by blocking business deals for Chinese takeovers without FIRB backing?
Well, Australia's foreign investment laws have always operated on the basis that the Treasurer of the day makes a final decision in relation to whether or not an investment is in Australia's national interest. And this is an important safeguard to ensure that ultimately not only do we have that national interest test, but public confidence of foreign investment into Australia is maintained. And so those processes, underpinned by FIRB analysis, but ultimately a judgment for the Treasurer of the day, need to consider all aspects around Australia's national interest, take that advice from FIRB, overlay it with other advice and analysis, and ultimately come to a judgment call. Australia remains very much one of the world's most open economies when it comes to welcoming foreign investment. The vast majority of applications that are received for foreign investment are approved, and over the last 12 months, the vast majority of applications have been approved, including the vast majority of applications from Chinese applicants through the FIRB process too.
How long would the WTO process take, and what's the worst thing that could happen to China if it found in Australia's favour?
So the WTO processes, as I acknowledged in my remarks, take longer than we would wish to be the case in an ideal world. It could take years. It could take years. So this is about achieving, as much as anything, a systemic outcome as well as a specific outcome. We want a specific outcome that recognises Australia's grain growers and barley industry operate in nothing other than entirely commercial ways and with the utmost of integrity. But we also want a systemic outcome that identifies the fact that the decisions that have been reached by Chinese authorities lack basis, are not underpinned by facts and evidence, and ultimately leads, we hope, to change in relation to their practices. The WTO processes enable and allow for third parties, for other countries, to become third parties to the processes as well. So we will welcome the participation of other nations through these processes, which will mean that this is not just a matter assessed in relation to the Australian barley industry, but hopefully can give rise to greater confidence in terms of the Chinese application of these processes to all nations into the future.
Your expectation, is it your expectation that other countries might join this and it might become a broader push?
It's quite commonplace for other countries to become third parties to proceedings in the WTO. Australia has done so on many occasions, China has done so on many occasions, and I would anticipate that others would do so on this occasion.
The WTO has been, the appellate court is now down to one judge thanks to Donald Trump, so it's usually got 7, down to 1. So you say it's going to take possibly years. Could it take decades, given that it's been stripped of all resources and practically useless at the moment?
Well, Andrew, you make an interesting point in that question, but it does actually also highlight an important point in relation to both Australia's and China's stated commitments to the World Trade Organisation and its processes. So there are essentially 3 distinct phases that this will go through, assuming there isn't an off-ramp in which negotiation settles the issue. The first phase is the consultation phase, which is a relatively limited process running over a couple of months, where the parties are essentially forced to engage in a consultation, in a mediation, if you like, to see if it can be resolved without having going to the next stages. Assuming that doesn't lead to an outcome, the second stage is the primary phase of considering the case, where a panel is formed in the WTO to consider the arguments and to ultimately form a judgment. Then there is an appeal right, which is what you're speaking of in terms of the appellate body of the WTO, which is currently in a state of dysfunction. However, a number of countries, around 20, worked together over the last year or so to agree upon an alternate approach whilst that appellate body is in that state of dysfunction. Notably, Australia and China both agreed to be parties to that alternate approach. So we do have a functional appeal avenue available if we ultimately get to that stage, and we do so as a result of the fact that both Australia and China have demonstrated a commitment to cooperate with the EU, with Canada and with others at the WTO in addressing this vacuum that exists in relation to its appellate body, And I hope that that mutual demonstration that Australia and China have both shown to the utilisation of the WTO's processes is also underpinned and reflected in the way in which this case is conducted. And ultimately, I again appeal for the fact that just as we have done so with Canada and the wine industry, and just as many others have done so in initiating WTO processes, there is always the ability to pause them and resolve these matters through dialogue instead.
Minister, it's been confirmed that Five Eyes officials are discussing potential joint retaliatory sanctions against China in response to what it has been doing to Australia, or possibly refusing to sell certain products to China that China refuses to purchase from Australia, like coal. Where do you think that level of response fits in with something more formal like the World Trade Organization? Would that be a move that you would support from our allies, given that, by your own admission, we are potentially entering into a years-long process, whereas this could actually bring China back to the table much faster?
I'll make 2 points there. The first is that Australia respects the proper processes, and we are engaging through the proper processes, and taking this dispute to the next stage of the World Trade Organization is just that. It is a utilisation of the proper processes that we've all signed up to in terms of settling trade disputes. The second point I'd make is that when it comes to the sales of Australian goods, and obviously the disruption that occurs when excessive tariffs are placed as part of an anti-dumping decision, as has been the case in relation to Australia's barley exports and our wine exports to China, of course we have to go and look for alternate markets to support those industries. Our network of trade agreements allows us to do that. Our relationships with other countries allow us to do that, and we will of course do everything we can, and are doing everything we can within our powers through our Austrade, diplomatic and other networks to use those relationships to help our producers find and access successfully those alternate markets.
This is retaliatory action that other large nations are considering joining in on our behalf. They're stepping up to the plate to help Australia. What's your take on that possibility?
It's for other nations to speak for themselves. I speak for Australia, and Australia is using the proper processes of the WTO and exploring wherever we can the opportunities in alternate markets, using our network of trade agreements and all of our other relationships to give our producers the best possible chance of accessing those markets.
Could this be the first of several cases? Are you looking at bringing similar actions on wine, coal, cotton, seafood, beef, anything else?
It is possible that there could be further actions, and certainly I would reserve all of Australia's rights in that regard. We have a series of different actions that China has taken during the course of this year, and each of them come with slightly different criteria for how you might respond in the WTO. Barley and wine are obviously both using similar criteria in relation to anti-dumping measures, and China's rulings and decisions on those are transparent. We think they're erroneous, but they're transparent, and we've got the ability to be able to respond to those. In relation to other matters, some of the trade sanctions are clearer, such as the use of phytosanitary or regulatory labelling and other standards, and if we don't see appropriate steps taken to be able to resolve those issues in accordance with the agreements and undertakings that we share, well, again, we could consider further action, including the potential use of the WTO. Others seem to be the application of pressure or market distorting factors within the Chinese system, where businesses within China, often state-owned enterprises, are being discouraged from purchasing Australian goods. Now that, of course, is a harder point to prove than where there are extensive judgments or rulings that have been made by Chinese officials behind it. And in those areas, we will monitor closely all of the trends that unfold in relation to purchasing decisions, watch that closely and see whether that leads us down certain avenues for appeal.